Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about indentured servitude and its transition into slavery in the United States, right? So I wanted to make this lecture because a lot of my students make two very common mistakes when we cover the idea of slavery in the United States. And the first mistake they make is they hear the word African and they immediately think slave, right? So by the mid 1600s or late 1600s, that would be a reality. But in the early years when the first Africans came here, that wasn't necessarily the case, right? The first Africans that arrived to America, to Jamestown in 1619, came as indentured servants, right? Uh, the other mistake people make when thinking about slavery is that the US always intended to be the slave nation, right? And this is also a mistake, right? Slavery developed in America rather fast. By the 1660s, 1670s, we already had the first slave codes. But the early years in the United States, we don't have slavery per se, right? What we have is indentured servitude, and it's going to develop into slavery by the late 1660s. And then we're going to have this slave nation, but that wasn't the intention of the United States from the beginning. That is the way that it developed, and that's what I want to cover today. How does this happen, right? So let's get started. All right, so like I mentioned, the first Africans that came to what is present day America, they arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 to work in the fields, right? So because they came to work in the fields, most of the people assumed that these Africans that they were slaves, right? But they were indentured servants, right? So the question is, what does it mean to be an indentured servant, right? So indentured servants is people making a contract, right? Voluntarily, you make a contract and you basically agree to work for 5 to 7 years in return to get my passage from Europe to America paid off. And while I'm in America, I'm gonna get house and food, right? Towards the end of my contract, I'm gonna get freedom dues, right? Freedom dues can be either be paid in money or land, right? So that is the idea of an indentured servant, right? The main difference is Africans do not come here voluntarily, right? Indentured servants do come here voluntarily. What I mean to say, guys, is that the treatment they get in America, even though they come for different circumstances, right? Indentured servants agree to be here voluntarily, Africans do not. But while they're in America, they're being treated the same, right? As indentured servants, right? So what is the treatment of an indentured servant, right? Because I see some students tell me like they made the comparison between indentured servants and slavery, right? So there are some parallels. For example, your contract could be bought or sold, right? So someone could buy you and they could sell you, right? You cannot get married without the permission of whoever has your contract, and you could get some corporal punishment, right? So those are some of the parallels. However, you need to remember that slavery is way different, right? You're permanently a slave. You're considered property. They can do whatever they want to you. You have no legal recourse against any of this. So it's way, 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 way worse being a slave, right? Although there are some parallels, right? The main difference again is indentured servants will become free. They're owed freedom dues, and they're gonna get land or money towards the end of it, right? So indentured servitude became the way to populate the colonies, right? Again, about 2/3 of the people come to America as indentured servants, and some of the Africans that come here are treated as indentured servants also, and some of them even go on to own property and have their own indentured servants, right? So the question is, why transition into slavery, right? So why go from indentured servitude into slavery? And the answer is that very tragically and very unfortunately, plantation owners uh, have less and less people wanting to come to America because the rumors of the treatment of the people here in the colonies is pretty horrible. And less people want to come to America, right? So uh, the reality is that very tragically, Africans become a better investment, right? They they have a better opportunity bringing Africans and having them as indentured servants than getting voluntary people to become indentured servants, right? Also, their skin color made them easy to identify if they ever escaped, right? The difference with indentured servants is that from Europe is that their skin color, when they escaped, it was very difficult for them to retrieve them, all right? Because they could blend in the next town and you would never find them, right? But that was different when you did with Africans, right? Because their skin color made it easier to identify, right? So that is one of the main reasons, right? The other one is the rumors, right, of how horrible it was, right? So eventually by 1660s, this plantation owners, they want to protect their investments, and that is the bottom line, right? Very unfortunately, the way they see it is, if I want to protect my investment, these people that I'm bringing over from Africa, how do I make sure that I get the best out of my investments, right? So they create what is called the slave codes, right? And that is what, is basically going to govern the lives of the slaves, right? What is basically going to say these guys are not indentured servants anymore, right? These people that come from Africa are gonna become slaves, right? These people, they make all these rules like basically you're a slave forever, as opposed to an indentured servant who has a contract. Like, this is permanent. The condition of your mother is what makes you whether you're free or slave. Because some of these indentured servants were having children, and the question was, what are these people, right? Are they indentured servants? Are they slaves? So the slave codes basically dictated, the condition of your mother is what's gonna decide whether you're a slave or not, right? So it's also gonna establish a way of punishment and what you can and what you cannot do, right? But this is until the early 1660s. So this is how we transition from indentured servitude into slavery. The reality is that people want to protect their investments, right? Very unfortunately, this is what they're thinking. The best way to protect the investment was to make it permanent, all right? So this is more or less how we transition from indentured servitude into slavery. The reality is that in the early days, it wasn't so much about white and black. It was a lot more about rich and poor, right? It was more about, are you rich enough to have a plantation and having indentured servants, or are you poor enough to be, a servant, right? And it's gonna slowly transition into a slave society, right? But that was not the intention from the beginning. So again, 1619, you have the first Africans who are treated as indentured servants, and then it's gonna develop into not enough people wanting to come over here again because of conditions marginally improve in Europe, so not a lot of people come here. And basically the main one is the idea that slaves become a better investment for the plantation owners, right? So this is how we go from this society of rich and poor to a slave society, right? I don't want to take more of your time. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be around, guys. Be safe.